The empire that built the roads beneath modern France lasted 1,000 years. The empire that paved over them has existed for less than 300. And when that asphalt cracks, and it will, the Roman stones will still be there, waiting. We call it a fall. That's the wrong verb. Rome didn't fall. Rome transformed into the church that baptized your ancestors, the laws that govern your contracts, the calendar that tells you what month it is. The western half collapsed, yes, but the eastern half outlived the Vikings, outlived the Crusades, outlived the Black Death. It didn't end until 1453, when Ottoman cannons finally breached the walls of Constantinople. And the idea of Rome? That never died at all. It just kept getting inherited by people who wanted its authority without understanding its costs. So what was Rome, really? Not the marble, not the legions, not the eagles and the triumphs and the gladiators. What was the engine that ran for a millennium, and what poison was built into the fuel? That's the story, and it starts not in a great city, but in a swamp. 800 years before the Common Era, the Italian peninsula was a crossroads, not a center. Everyone passed through. No one unified it. Stand on one of the 7 hills above the Tiber River in that age and look around. To the south, Greek colonies dominated the coast. Syracuse alone held more people than any city in mainland Greece, 250,000 souls speaking Doric and worshiping Zeus in temples that dwarfed anything the locals could build. To the north, the Etruscans ruled a loose confederation of city-states, wealthy from iron mines and Mediterranean trade, and their language still undeciphered, their painted tombs full of dancers and demons. Along the western shores, Phoenician traders from Carthage hugged the coastline, their purple-sailed ships carrying tin and silver and slaves. And from the north, beyond the Alps, Celtic warriors descended every few generations to raid, plunder, and remind everyone that civilization was a thin line scratched in dirt. In the middle of this, in the hills above a marshy river crossing, lived farmers, Latin-speaking villagers who watched foreign ships sail past, who traded salt and cattle at the ford where the Tiber could be crossed, who built their huts from wattle and daub and buried their dead in the hillsides. They had no great temples, no written laws, no kings worth remembering. What they had was a location. The Tiber crossing was the last easy ford before the sea. Salt came up from the coast. Cattle came down from the hills. Traders from every direction met at that ford, exchanged goods, moved on. The cluster of villages above that crossing didn't exist because of destiny. It existed because of geography, a market at a river crossing, a truck stop in modern terms, nothing more. Life in those villages meant waking before dawn, walking to fields that your grandfather had cleared, working the soil with wooden plows that barely scratched the volcanic earth. It meant eating wheat porridge, drinking sour wine, praying to gods whose names would later embarrass Roman scholars: Robigus, the god of wheat rust, Stercolinus, the god of manure. It meant fearing the summer fevers that rose from the marsh, of fearing the Celtic raids that came without warning, fearing the Etruscan lords who viewed you as a source of tribute and conscripts. A Roman in 800 BC was born in a one-room hut with a smoke hole in the roof, lived to maybe 40 if disease and war spared him, and was buried in a clay urn within sight of where he was born. At this same moment, the Greeks were debating philosophy, the Phoenicians were circumnavigating Africa, the Assyrians were building an empire from the Nile to the Persian Gulf. The villagers at the Tiber ford were nobody. What changed? To answer that, you need to understand the forces that would wrestle for control of this civilization for the next 1,000 years. Call them ingredients. There were 4. The first was the Senate, an aristocracy that believed it was the state itself. These were the patrician families, the landowners, the men who claimed descent from the founders. Every Roman institution would be designed around one obsession: preventing any single man from holding permanent power. The kings they'd overthrow had traumatized them so deeply that the fear of tyranny was written into the republic's DNA. Shared power, short terms, checks on ambition. They built a government out of vetoes. The second was the legions, a citizen army that started as farmers defending their own fields and became a military machine that required constant victories to feed itself. Soldiers expected land when they mustered out. Land came from conquest. Conquest required soldiers. This loop would build the greatest empire the Mediterranean had ever seen. It would also, eventually, break the republic in half. And the third was the provinces, the conquered peoples who began as subjects and ended as Romans. Rome's great innovation wasn't military, it was cultural. Defeat an enemy, then offer them a deal. Keep your land, keep your gods, keep your laws, but send us soldiers and tribute. Fight for us, and your sons might become citizens. Your grandsons might become senators. The borders of Roman identity kept expanding. That flexibility was Rome's greatest strength. It was also an identity crisis that never fully resolved. The fourth was the frontier, the edge. Beyond it lay peoples Rome called barbarians, though many were more organized than Rome wanted to admit. The frontier wasn't a wall, it was a membrane. It blocked some threats and absorbed others. Tribes that raided one generation might be auxiliary soldiers the next, and the line between Roman and barbarian was always blurring. Senate, legions, provinces, frontier. These four forces would collide and combine for 1,000 years. The story of Rome is the story of their interaction. The founding myth went like this. Twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, sons of the god Mars, suckled by a wolf, founded a city. They quarreled over where to build the walls. Romulus killed his brother, built the walls his way, and gave the city his name. Rome was born in fratricide. Romans told this story for centuries. They built statues of the wolf. They celebrated the founding date, April 21st, 753 BC, as if it were historical fact. The tale was sacred. It was also invented. Archaeological layers at Rome show continuous habitation from roughly 1000 BC. No single founding moment, no Romulus, no wolf. What actually happened was slower and less dramatic. Latin villages on the Seven Hills gradually merged, probably under Etruscan influence, probably through trade and intermarriage and the occasional war. The founding was backdated centuries later by Romans who needed a birthday to celebrate, a myth to justify their existence. They made one up. But here's what matters about the myth they chose. It's not a story about divine favor or peaceful beginnings. It's a story about violence and walls. Romulus murdered his brother over a boundary line. The first generation of Romans kidnapped and raped the women of the neighboring Sabine tribe because they had no wives of their own. Rome understood from the beginning that its existence required violence and that walls mattered more than blood. The last kings of Rome weren't mythical, and they were Etruscan, foreign rulers from the sophisticated cities to the north, men who brought architecture and religion and writing to the Roman backwater. The final one was named Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He ruled for 25 years, expanded Roman territory, built the great temple on the Capitoline Hill. What history remembers is his last night. His son raped a noblewoman named Lucretia. She told her father and her husband what had happened, then took a knife and drove it into her own chest. Before she died, she said, "I clear myself of guilt, but not of punishment." Her suicide ignited a revolt, The Tarquins were driven out of Rome forever. The monarchy was abolished. The Republic was born. The story may be embellished. The trauma was real. Rome had been ruled by kings for 200 years. After 509 BC, the word king became an insult. Romans swore they would never tolerate a tyrant again. They built an entire government around that fear. 2 consuls instead of 1, so power would always be shared. Annual terms so no one could entrench. A senate of elders to advise and constrain. A web of magistracies with overlapping authorities and mutual vetoes. The Romans didn't invent democracy. Their system was aristocratic at its core, weighted toward the wealthy, dominated by a handful of families. But they invented something that would matter just as much: institutional paranoia. They were so afraid of tyranny that they built a machine specifically designed to prevent it. For 300 years, that machine held. This brings us to a small farm outside Rome, in the year 458 BC. 4 acres of land, barely enough to feed a family. A man named Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus was plowing his field when the messengers arrived. They came covered in dust, their horses winded from the ride. The Senate had sent them. There was a crisis. A Roman army had marched into the hills to fight the Aequi, a mountain tribe that raided Roman territory every summer. The campaign had gone wrong. The entire force was now surrounded on Mount Algidus, trapped, starving, awaiting slaughter. If they fell, Rome would lose half its fighting men. The Aequi would sweep down into the valley. Everything the Republic had built was at risk. The Senate had met in emergency session. They needed a dictator, a constitutional office reserved for existential crises, granting one man absolute power for up to 6 months. They needed someone who could raise a relief force, march immediately, and defeat an enemy that had already destroyed one Roman army. They had chosen Cincinnatus. He was not a young man. He had held the consulship years before, served his time in the legions, earned his reputation. Now he was a farmer, partly by choice, partly by circumstance. His son had been exiled for political crimes. The fines had nearly bankrupted the family. Cincinnatus had retreated to his small plot of land, away from the forum's intrigues. He wanted to be left alone. The messengers found him behind his plow, sweating in the summer heat. His wife Ricilia saw them first, called out to him across the field. He stood still for a moment. He knew what messengers from the Senate meant. His wife brought his toga, the formal garment of a Roman citizen, which he'd set aside for work. He wiped the dirt from his face. I wrapped the wool around his shoulders and walked to meet them. "The Senate calls," they told him. "Put on your toga." He did what the Republic asked. He always had. Within hours, Cincinnatus was dictator. Within days, he had raised a second army from every man in Rome who could carry a spear. He marched through the night, reached Mount Algidus, and attacked the Aequi from behind while the trapped army broke out from within. The enemy was crushed. The siege was broken. The threat to Rome was over. 16 days. That's how long it took, from the moment the messengers reached his farm to the moment the war ended. Then Cincinnatus did something that would define Roman identity for centuries. He gave the power back. The dictatorship allowed him 6 months of absolute authority. He had 16 days left on the emergency mandate alone, and he could have held office, accumulated honors, positioned his family for wealth and influence. Roman politics rewarded exactly that kind of ambition. Cincinnatus walked back to his farm. He picked up his plow. He finished the season's work. The Romans told this story for 500 years. They built statues to him. They named things after him. When George Washington resigned his commission and returned to Mount Vernon, Educated Americans understood the reference immediately. He was being Cincinnatus. The city in Ohio still bears the name. But here's the verdict, and it's not the one Romans wanted to hear. Cincinnatus was real, but his story was already becoming propaganda within a generation of his death. The tale was told and retold to remind ambitious men what Roman virtue looked like. Serve the state, refuse permanent power, go home. And for 3 centuries, that story more or less matched reality. The system of short terms and shared power actually worked. Men competed fiercely for office, but they accepted defeat, they obeyed term limits, they went home when their time was up. Then the wars got too long, the victories got too profitable, the generals got too powerful, and going home stopped being what ambitious men did. Cincinnatus represented who Romans believed they were. The question the next 5 centuries would answer was whether Romans could keep being that, or whether success would make the Cincinnatus model impossible. The young republic was not an empire. It was a city-state surrounded by enemies. To the south, other Latin cities resented Roman dominance and periodically revolted. To the east, on the Samnites, mountain warriors with a reputation for ferocity controlled the Apennine spine of Italy and raided lowland farms. To the north, the Etruscans still held their wealthy cities and viewed Rome as an upstart. And beyond all of them, past the Alps, the Celtic tribes waited. In 390 BC, they stopped waiting. A Gallic army swept down from the north, smashed a Roman force at the Allia River, and marched into Rome itself. For the first time since the kings, foreign soldiers walked Roman streets. They burned what would burn, looted what would carry, killed those too slow to flee. Only the Capitoline Hill held out, defended by the last Roman soldiers and, according to legend, saved by the honking of sacred geese that alerted the guards to a night attack. Eventually, the Gauls left. Romans paid them in gold to go. The ransom was weighed out in the Forum. When Roman officials complained that the Gauls were using rigged scales, the Gallic chieftain Brennus threw his sword onto the weights and spoke words that Romans never forgot. Vae victis, woe to the conquered. That trauma lasted centuries. Rome would not be taken by a foreign enemy again until 410 AD, 800 years later. The sack by the Gauls taught Romans something that would shape every policy that followed. Expand or die. Build buffers. Conquer the conquerors before they conquer you. Never be caught weak again. Within 150 years, Rome controlled all of Italy. Not through massacre, through the alliance system. Defeat a people, then offer them terms. Keep your land, your laws, your gods. In exchange, send us soldiers. In every war Rome won gave them more soldiers for the next war. It was a military pyramid scheme, and it kept paying out. But across the water, there was an empire that made Rome look like a village. Carthage, a Phoenician colony that had become a Mediterranean superpower. They held North Africa, southern Spain, Sardinia, western Sicily. They had a navy that dwarfed anything Rome could build, a trading network that stretched from Britain to the Black Sea, wealth beyond Roman comprehension. Carthage didn't need to conquer. They bought what they wanted. For a century, Rome and Carthage eyed each other across the narrow strait between Sicily and Africa. They signed treaties. They defined spheres of influence. They pretended coexistence was possible. It wasn't. In 264 BC, the border dispute in Sicily gave both sides the excuse they'd been waiting for. Rome built its first real navy, copying a captured Carthaginian warship plank by plank, training rowers on wooden frames set up on shore. They threw themselves into a war against the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean, a war they had no business winning. They won it anyway. 23 years of war, hundreds of thousands dead, and at the end, Carthage surrendered Sicily. Rome had its first overseas province. The alliance system that had conquered Italy now reached across the sea. But Carthage wasn't finished. They rebuilt their army, conquered Spain, found new silver mines to pay new soldiers, and in their ranks, a general's son was growing up, raised on hatred of Rome. His name was Hannibal Barca. He had sworn an oath as a child, or at his father's command, standing before the altar of the gods, eternal hatred of Rome. He would keep that oath. The system Rome built, citizen soldiers who expected land, short wars close to home, farmers who fought in summer and plowed in winter, had worked perfectly for Italian wars. Quick campaigns, home for harvest, land for veterans. What happens when the wars last decades? When the soldiers can't farm because they're dying in Spain or Africa? When the campaigns stretch so far that men serve for 10 years, 20 years, and come home to find their farms sold, their families scattered, their place in the Republic gone? That question would crack the Republic in half. But first, Rome had to survive what Hannibal was about to bring across the Alps. The story was just beginning. In the spring of 218 BC, the Hannibal Barca marched out of Spain with 90,000 men and 37 war elephants. He did not take the sea route to Italy. Carthage had lost naval supremacy in the First War, and Roman fleets controlled the Western Mediterranean. Instead, he did something that military logic said was impossible. He crossed the Alps. The march took 5 months. The army climbed through passes choked with snow, hacked paths along cliff faces, lost men and animals to cold, starvation, and hostile mountain tribes. The elephants, beasts of African and Indian savanna, trudged through alpine ice. By the time Hannibal descended into the Po Valley, he had lost half his army. Most of the elephants were dead. It didn't matter. What emerged from those mountains was still the most dangerous military force Rome had ever faced, and it was now standing on Italian soil with no Roman army between it and the city. Rome sent armies to stop him. Hannibal destroyed them. At the Trebia River, he lured Roman cavalry into a trap and slaughtered them while hidden infantry struck the legions from behind. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed an entire consular army in morning fog. 15,000 Romans died in 3 hours, many drowning as they fled into the lake. The consul himself was killed, his body never found. Then came Cannae. August 2nd, 216 BC. The largest army Rome had ever assembled. 80,000 men, 8 legions, the combined military power of the Republic, met Hannibal's 50,000 on a plain in southern Italy. The Romans were confident. They had numbers. They had heavy infantry that had conquered Italy. They formed their legions deep, planning to smash through the Carthaginian center with sheer mass. Hannibal let them. His center bowed backward as the Romans pushed, drawing the legions deeper into a crescent that slowly wrapped around them. Then his cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen on both flanks, swung behind the Roman infantry and sealed the trap. The greatest army Rome had ever fielded was surrounded. What followed was not a battle, it was butchery. 50,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. Some estimates run higher, 70,000. More than the first day of the Somme, more than Gettysburg, the worst single-day military disaster in the history of Western warfare, and it happened on a sunny August afternoon in Italy while farmers watched from the hills. The ground was so soaked with blood that Hannibal's soldiers slipped on it. They found Romans who had buried their heads in the dirt, trying to suffocate themselves rather than wait for the swords. Among the dead, 1 consul, 2 consuls from the previous year, 29 military tribunes, 80 senators. The Roman leadership class was decapitated in an afternoon. Hannibal sent a messenger to Carthage with proof of the victory. 3 bushels of gold rings stripped from the fingers of dead Roman aristocrats. Rome should have surrendered. Any rational calculation of power said the war was over. Hannibal controlled southern Italy. Rome's allies were defecting. The treasury was empty, the armies destroyed, the leadership dead. Rome did not surrender, or they refused to ransom prisoners, an almost unthinkable breach of Mediterranean custom, because ransoming would admit defeat. They armed slaves, enlisted teenagers, melted temple decorations for weapons. They appointed a dictator named Quintus Fabius Maximus, and he implemented a strategy that Romans hated but desperately needed. Don't fight Hannibal. Shadow him. Burn crops in his path. Cut off foragers. Let time and distance do what Roman swords could not. They called Fabius the delayer. It was not a compliment. Romans wanted revenge, wanted battle, wanted to prove that Cannae was an aberration. Fabius gave them survival instead of glory, and slowly, painfully, it worked. Hannibal could win battles, but he couldn't win sieges. He had no siege equipment, no supply line, no reinforcements. His Italian allies discovered that joining Carthage meant Roman retaliation when Hannibal moved on. Year after year, he marched through Italy, undefeated in the field, unable to end the war. The trap he'd sprung at Cannae became a trap around himself. He was stuck in Italy, bleeding strength, waiting for help that kept not arriving. His brother Hasdrubal tried to bring that help. In 207 BC, Hasdrubal crossed the Alps with a second army, racing to join Hannibal for a combined assault on Rome. Roman forces intercepted him at the Metaurus River. Hasdrubal died in the battle, and his head was cut off, carried south, and thrown into Hannibal's camp. When Hannibal saw his brother's face, he reportedly said, "Now I see the destiny of Carthage." He stayed in Italy for 4 more years. He had nowhere else to go. The man who finally beat Hannibal was 24 years old when he volunteered for a command that no senator would touch. Publius Cornelius Scipio had already survived Cannae, one of the few officers to escape that slaughter. He had watched his father and uncle, both Roman generals, die in Spain trying to cut Hannibal's supply lines. By 211 BC, the situation in Spain was catastrophic. Carthage controlled the entire peninsula. Its silver mines were funding Hannibal's war, and Roman forces there had been virtually annihilated. The Senate needed someone to take command in Spain. No one volunteered. The posting was suicide. Everyone knew it. Scipio was too young for the rank, had never held the required offices, had no legal standing to command armies. He volunteered anyway. The Senate waived the rules because they had no choice, and they gave him the troops they could spare, not many, and sent him across the sea to face an enemy that had already killed his family and shattered 2 Roman armies. What Scipio did in Spain over the next 4 years remains one of the great military campaigns in history. He captured New Carthage, the enemy's main base, in a single day by timing his assault to the tidal patterns of the harbor lagoon. He defeated 3 separate Carthaginian armies, playing them against each other, striking before they could combine. He didn't just win battles. He won over Spanish tribes, offering them better terms than Carthage had. By 206 BC, Spain was Roman. Hannibal's supply line, his source of silver and soldiers, was gone. Then Scipio proposed something that terrified the Senate: invade Africa. take the war to Carthage itself, force them to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend their homeland, end the war not by chasing Hannibal through Italian hills, but by threatening to burn Carthage to the ground. The Senate resisted. Fabius Maximus, the great delayer, argued against it. Too risky, too far, too likely to fail. But Scipio had something the cautious senators lacked: a victorious army that loved him, and a reputation that made refusal politically impossible. In 204 BC, he sailed for Africa. Carthage panicked. They tried negotiation. They tried delay. They tried one last alliance with a Numidian king. Nothing worked. Scipio burned their farms, defeated their armies, and marched toward Carthage itself. They had only one option left. They recalled Hannibal. Imagine that moment. Hannibal Barca, who had crossed the Alps, who had destroyed Roman armies for 15 years, who had never lost a battle on Italian soil, received orders to abandon the war he had been fighting since he was a child. He gathered the remnants of his army, men who had followed him for a decade and a half, many of whom had been born during the campaign and knew no other home, and sailed for Africa. He was seeing his homeland for the first time since he was 9 years old. At Zama, in October 202 BC, the two greatest generals of the age finally met. Before the battle, they talked. The ancient sources say Hannibal requested a meeting, that the two men spoke through interpreters, that Hannibal offered peace terms. Scipio refused. We don't know exactly what was said. We know how it ended. Scipio won. He turned Hannibal's own tactics against him. Cavalry sweeping behind the Carthaginian infantry. The encirclement that had destroyed Rome at Cannae, now destroying Carthage at Zama. 20,000 Carthaginians died. Hannibal escaped, but the war was over. Carthage surrendered, paid an enormous indemnity, gave up its fleet, abandoned Spain forever. Scipio returned to Rome in triumph. They gave him a new name, Africanus, the man who had conquered Africa. He was 34 years old, and he had saved the Republic. Rome never forgave him. Within a decade, political enemies were attacking him for corruption, for arrogance, for acting too much like a king. His brother was prosecuted. His reputation was shredded in the Forum by men who had cowered in Rome while he fought in Africa. Scipio eventually withdrew to his country estate, bitter and tired. He asked to be buried there, far from the city he had rescued. His epitaph reportedly read, "Ungrateful fatherland, you will not have my bones." This was Rome's relationship with greatness. The system was designed to prevent anyone from rising too high, and it worked, even on the men who saved it. Scipio's victory made Rome the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Scipio's fate reminded every ambitious Roman that success was dangerous. The Republic could not tolerate heroes. That worked, until it didn't. The Hannibalic War changed Rome forever. Not just the victory, the cost. Rome lost 1/5 of all adult male citizens during the 17 years of fighting. In modern terms, if America fought a war that deadly, 12 million men would die. The Italian countryside was devastated. Farms that had been in families for generations were destroyed, their owners dead in Spain or Africa, their land bought up by wealthy aristocrats who could afford to wait out the chaos. But Rome had also learned something. The alliance system held. Hannibal spent 15 years trying to crack it, and while some cities defected, most did not. The Romans rewarded loyalty and punished defection with systematic brutality, and the lesson stuck. When the war ended, Rome's grip on Italy was stronger than ever, and now there was no one left to challenge them. Over the next 60 years, Rome conquered the entire Mediterranean world, with an efficiency that still startles historians. Macedon fell in 3 wars. The kingdom of Alexander the Great, the most prestigious military power in the Greek world, reduced to a Roman province. The Seleucid Empire, ruling from Syria to Persia, was smashed when it made the mistake of harboring Hannibal in his exile. Greece itself was absorbed, its cities made free under Roman supervision, which meant free to do whatever Rome approved. Carthage, stripped of its military but still wealthy, watched as Roman senators eyed its revival with paranoid fury. One senator ended every speech the same way, no matter the topic: Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. And furthermore, Carthage must be destroyed. His name was Cato, and he was 82 years old when Rome finally did it. In 146 BC, Roman forces besieged Carthage, breached the walls, fought house to house for 6 days, and burned the city to ashes. The survivors, 50,000 people, were sold into slavery. The ground was supposedly sown with salt, though that detail is probably legend. What's certain is that Carthage ceased to exist as a political entity. Its territory became the Roman province of Africa. In the same year, Rome destroyed Corinth, the wealthiest city in Greece, as punishment for a failed rebellion. The timing was coincidence. The message was not. The Republic, that had been a regional Italian power in 264 BC, now ruled from Spain to Syria. The Mediterranean, which Greeks had shared with Phoenicians and Egyptians for centuries, became what Romans called it: Mare Nostrum, our sea. What did this empire actually look like? Not from the Senate floor or the battlefield, from the ground? Picture a merchant named Gaius arriving in Rome around 120 BC. He's been traveling for 3 weeks from Massilia, the Greek colony that's now effectively a Roman client state. And he trades wine and olive oil, commodities the Italian heartland can't get enough of, and he's made the journey a dozen times before. The road he walks is Roman, stone-paved, arrow-straight where terrain allows, with milestones every 1,000 paces marking the distance to Rome. The engineering is recent. His father remembered when this route was mud tracks and mule paths, adding weeks to the journey. Now the roads run everywhere the legions have marched, 250,000 miles of them, eventually, farther than the modern American interstate system. A messenger can travel from Rome to London in 2 weeks. Gaius makes his journey in 3, because his carts are heavy with amphorae. He enters the city through the Porta Capena, where the traffic backs up for hours. Carts and wagons and herds of animals all waiting for inspection, here for tolls, for the simple bottleneck of 1 million people trying to move through gates designed for a fraction of that. The noise is overwhelming. Vendors shouting, animals complaining, wheels grinding on stone. The smell is worse. 1 million people with inadequate sewage, plus the tanneries and the fishmongers and the sacrificial smoke from 100 temples. Rome in 120 BC is not the marble city of Augustus. It's brick and wood and plaster, crammed into the spaces between 7 hills, buildings stacked 5 and 6 stories high, because land is precious and people keep coming. The insulae, apartment blocks, creak and groan and occasionally collapse. Fire is a constant terror. The rich live on hilltops and houses with gardens and fountains. The poor live in single rooms without kitchens, cooking forbidden because of fire risk, eating at street stalls, emptying chamber pots out windows. Gaius finds his usual warehouse near the river docks. The Tiber is Rome's lifeline. 400,000 tons of grain per year arrive by ship from Sicily and Africa and Egypt, enough to feed a population that couldn't possibly sustain itself on Italian agriculture alone. Without that grain, Rome starves in weeks. Everyone knows this. No one talks about what it means. He sells his wine to a factor who will sell it to a distributor, who will sell it to tavern keepers and wealthy households. He's paid in silver denarii, coins stamped with the faces of Roman magistrates, a currency that's accepted from Britain to Babylon. With his profit, he buys garum, fermented fish sauce, Rome's ketchup, produced in industrial quantities in Spain and used on everything, to sell back in Massilia. Before he leaves, he visits the Forum. Not for politics. Gaius isn't a citizen, just a Latin with trading rights, but because the Forum is the center of the world. He watches a senator in a purple-bordered toga giving a speech, doesn't understand the legal details, understands perfectly the body language. This man is performing authority for an audience of other men who will judge his performance, and his family will hear about it by dinner. He watches a sacrifice at the temple of Saturn, blood and smoke and prayers for prosperity. He watches a slave auction, doesn't buy, doesn't look too long. Gaius leaves Rome richer than he arrived. The system works for him. What he doesn't see, what no merchant on a 3-week trading journey would see, is the countryside he passed through. The farms are larger than his father described, and there are fewer of them. Vineyards and olive groves worked by chain gangs of slaves have replaced the small plots of wheat and vegetables that once fed citizen families. The small farmers are gone, dead in Spain, bankrupt while at war, bought out by aristocrats who can operate at scales that make free labor unprofitable. Every slave Gaius passed represented a Roman family that no longer worked that land. Every great estate represented a citizen soldier class that was disappearing. The conquest of the Mediterranean brought 150,000 slaves to the Roman market in a single campaign in Epirus. By 100 BC, slaves may have made up a third of Italy's population. The labor that once produced citizen soldiers now produced profit for aristocrats. The engine of conquest was destroying the foundation it had been built on. The man who understood this problem, or at least understood that the army needed transformation, was named Gaius Marius. He was not from the great families. He was a new man, a novus homo, from a family that had never held the consulship. He was ugly, blunt, and brilliant at war. In 107 BC, facing a stubborn conflict in North Africa, Marius did something that tradition had forbidden. He recruited soldiers from the landless poor. Before Marius, you needed property to serve in the legions. The logic was ancient. Only men with something to lose would fight to protect it. Only citizens with land understood what Rome was for. And the army was not a profession. It was an obligation of ownership. Marius threw that away. He needed soldiers, and the property-owning class was too small to provide them. So he opened recruitment to anyone who would serve: the urban poor, the dispossessed farmers, the men who had nothing and wanted everything. He gave them equipment at state expense, standardized it for the first time. He gave them training that made Roman legions the most disciplined force in the ancient world. He gave them a new sacred object, the eagle standard, the symbol of the legion itself, to be defended unto death. And he gave them something else, a path to land and wealth that didn't exist anywhere else. The Senate wouldn't provide for veterans. It never had. But Marius could promise them land. Conquered land, distributed by the commander who had led them to victory. After your 20 years of service, after the blood and the marches and the sieges, you would get a farm in Spain or Africa or Gaul. Not because the Republic rewarded you, but because your general took care of his men. Do you see what changed? Before Marius, soldiers were citizens serving the Republic. After Marius, Soldiers were professionals serving the general who paid them. The loyalty shifted. The armies became private, and every ambitious man in Rome took notes. Marius himself won 7 consulships, an unprecedented number, saved Rome from a massive Germanic invasion, and died old, in bed, clutching a 7th consulship he'd seized by force in his final years. He proved that military genius plus loyal legions equaled unstoppable political power. Then his protege was a young aristocrat named Sulla, who would march those same legions against Rome itself. By 100 BC, the Republic ruled the Mediterranean. It had the best army in the world, the most sophisticated road network, a legal system that even conquered people's respected, and a wealth that made kings envious. It was also already dying. The citizen soldier class was gone, replaced by professional armies loyal to commanders, not country. The wealth of conquest had concentrated in fewer hands than ever before, creating an aristocracy of obscene riches ruling over urban masses dependent on grain doles. The provinces, the peoples Rome had absorbed, were growing restless, and the Italian allies who had bled for Rome at Cannae were asking a question that Rome didn't want to answer. When do we get to be citizens? And the Senate still believed it was in control. It still met in the same chamber, still debated with the same rituals, still elected consuls every year, just as it had when Cincinnatus put down his plow. But the plebeians had elected tribunes named Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and those tribunes had tried to redistribute land to the poor, and the Senate had killed them, beat them to death in public, threw their bodies in the river, killed their supporters by the hundreds. After the Gracchi, ambitious men learned the lesson. Reform from within gets you murdered. Seize power first. Ask forgiveness never. The Republic had survived Hannibal. It had conquered the world. Now it would discover that the armies built to conquer that world could conquer Rome just as easily. Sulla would march on Rome in 88 BC, and the first Roman general to conquer his own city. He would not be the last. Sulla marched on Rome in 88 BC with 6 legions at his back. He marched because the Senate had taken away his command and given it to his rival. He marched because the army was his now. Those were his veterans, paid with his victories, loyal to the man who'd made them rich. No Roman general had ever done this. For 400 years, the line between military force and political power had held. Armies fought foreign enemies. Politics happened in the forum. The distinction was sacred. Sulla erased it in an afternoon. His legions entered Rome through gates that had no defenders. The city wasn't fortified. It had never needed to be. Romans didn't fight Romans, so there were no walls to keep Roman armies out. And Sulla's soldiers walked through the streets with swords drawn, and the people who had conquered the Mediterranean discovered they had no way to stop their own conquest. Marius, Sulla's rival, fled. The Senate capitulated. Sulla held the city, passed the laws he wanted, assigned himself the eastern command that had been stolen from him, and then, because the foreign war still needed fighting, he marched away to Asia Minor to deal with a king named Mithridates, who had massacred 80,000 Italian merchants in a single coordinated slaughter. While Sulla was gone, Marius came back. He took Rome the same way Sulla had, with an army through streets that couldn't resist. His soldiers killed Sulla's supporters. They hunted senators through the forum, bodies piled in the public spaces. Marius, old and increasingly erratic, drank himself to death within weeks of seizing power. But the message was delivered. Rome could be taken. Rome could be held. The only thing that mattered was who had more legions. Sulla returned from the east in 83 BC, richer than any Roman had ever been. With an army hardened by 4 years of war and hungry for Italian land, the civil war that followed killed more Romans than Hannibal had. When it ended, Sulla controlled everything. He made himself dictator, not dictator for 6 months, the old constitutional limit. Dictator for the restoration of the Republic, meaning as long as he wanted. He published lists of enemies on tablets in the Forum. The lists were called proscriptions. If your name appeared, anyone could kill you, your property went to the state, and your sons and grandsons were banned from holding office forever. 520 senators, 1,600 equestrians, their names carved in public for anyone to see. Terror as administrative procedure. Sulla remade the Constitution to strengthen the Senate and weaken the tribunes who had threatened aristocratic power. He killed everyone who might oppose the changes. Then he did something no one expected. He retired, walked away from absolute power, moved to his country estate, wrote memoirs, drank heavily, died within 2 years, reportedly of a disease that made his flesh rot while he was still alive. Ancient sources describe worms and burst organs, though the details may be invented revenge. The republic he restored lasted 20 years, long enough for a generation of ambitious men to study his playbook, take power with legions, kill opponents systematically, rewrite the rules. And the only mistake Sulla made, they concluded, was giving it up. But the fracture had begun decades before Sulla marched. It had begun with a question that Rome couldn't answer honestly. What do you do when the system that built your power is destroying the people who built it? The man who asked that question most clearly was named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, and in 133 BC, he thought he had an answer. Tiberius came from Rome's highest aristocracy. His mother was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal. He had served with distinction in Spain, survived a disaster that killed most of his army, negotiated a peace treaty that saved 20,000 Roman soldiers from annihilation. He was brilliant, connected, and destined for the highest offices. He was also troubled by something he'd seen on the roads of Italy. Traveling through Etruria on his way to Spain, Tiberius had passed through countryside that should have been filled with Roman farmers, the citizen soldiers who had conquered the peninsula and beaten Carthage, the backbone of the legion system. Instead, he saw latifundia, vast estates worked by chain gangs of foreign slaves. The small farms were gone. The farmers who had owned them were dead in Spain or Africa, or dispossessed and drifting to Rome, or sold out to aristocrats who could wait out any war. The rich were getting richer. The poor were getting desperate. And the army was running out of the citizen soldiers it was legally required to recruit. When Tiberius was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC, he proposed a solution: enforce the existing land laws. Rome had old statutes limiting how much public land any individual could hold, laws that were systematically ignored. Redistribute the excess to landless citizens. Rebuild the farmer class. Save the Republic. The Senate exploded. Not because the proposal was radical. It wasn't. The laws Tiberius wanted to enforce were already on the books. What enraged the aristocracy was simpler. Those illegal landholdings represented their wealth, their villas, their vineyards, their slave-worked estates. Tiberius was threatening to take what they had stolen and give it to people who had nothing. They found a tribune to veto the bill. Rome's constitution allowed any tribune to block any legislation, a feature designed to prevent tyranny, now weaponized to protect wealth. Tiberius responded by having the blocking tribune, Octavius, are removed from office through a popular vote. This was legal, probably. No one had ever done it before. The constitutional machinery creaked under the strain. The land bill passed. Commissioners were appointed to survey land and redistribute it. Tiberius announced he would run for a second consecutive term as tribune, unusual, maybe unprecedented, necessary to protect his reform from being reversed the moment he left office. On election day, July 133 BC, rumors swept Rome that Tiberius intended to make himself king. He had touched his head during a speech, and someone decided this meant he was asking for a crown. The accusation was absurd. It was also effective. A group of senators, led by Tiberius's own cousin, gathered on the Capitoline Hill. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: chair legs, broken furniture, clubs. When Tiberius and his supporters approached the voting area, the senators attacked. They beat the tribune of the plebs to death in broad daylight in a sacred space during an election. They killed 300 of his supporters. They threw the bodies in the Tiber without burial rites. No one was prosecuted. The Senate declared the killings justified. Tiberius had been a would-be tyrant, and tyrants could be killed without trial. They invented the legal theory on the spot and dared anyone to challenge it. The crisis Tiberius had tried to solve, the disappearing farmer class, continued. The land commission distributed some acres before aristocratic resistance strangled it. Within a decade, the situation was worse than before. Tiberius's younger brother Gaius tried again. 10 years later. He was smarter and more ruthless than Tiberius, and his program was broader. Grain subsidies for the urban poor, rights for Italian allies, checks on senatorial judicial power. He held the tribunate for 2 years, built a coalition of the dispossessed, and briefly looked like he might succeed. The Senate cornered him on the Aventine Hill in 121 BC. Rather than be captured, Gaius had a slave cut his throat. The slave followed him into death. 3,000 of Gaius's supporters were killed in the violence that followed, judicially murdered after show trials, or simply butchered in the streets. The Gracchi were dead, the land crisis remained, and the Republic had learned something about itself. Reform from within got you killed. The system would rather murder its saviors than share its wealth. Every ambitious Roman after 121 BC understood the lesson. If you wanted to change Rome, you needed an army first. The decades between the Gracchi and Sulla saw the logic play out. Marius's military reforms created professional armies loyal to commanders, not the state. The social war of 91 to 88 BC forced Rome to grant citizenship to all Italians, doubling the citizen population overnight, but solving nothing about power. Sulla's march proved that legions could take the city. His prescriptions proved that mass murder was an acceptable political tool. What emerged from this chaos was not a reformed republic, but a wounded one, still functioning, still holding elections, still debating in the Senate. But everyone knew the rules had changed. Power came from soldiers now. The question was which soldiers and whose. For 20 years after Sulla, 3 men accumulated enough military force to terrify the Senate. Pompey, who had conquered the East and reorganized Rome's provinces from Syria to Judea. Crassus, the richest man in Roman history, who had crushed Spartacus's slave rebellion and crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way. And Julius Caesar, a brilliant young politician drowning in debt, who saw clearly that military glory was the only path to power that mattered. In 60 BC, they made a deal. The historians call it the First Triumvirate, but that implies something official. It was nothing of the kind. It was 3 gangsters dividing territory, pooling resources, and promising to support each other against the Senate that feared all of them. Pompey got his eastern settlements ratified. Crassus got tax contracts for his business allies. Caesar got the consulship and then something more valuable, a 5-year military command in Gaul. Gaul was Rome's northern frontier, Celts and Germans, forests and fog, a land of warrior tribes that had sacked Rome 4 centuries earlier. It was also an opportunity. Conquer Gaul, and you had loot to pay soldiers, glory to impress voters, and an army loyal enough to follow you anywhere. Caesar spent 8 years in Gaul. The conquest was methodical and brutal. 800 towns destroyed, 1 million people killed, another 1 million enslaved. He faced down Germanic invasions, crossed the Rhine to terrorize tribes that had never seen Roman legions, even sailed to Britain twice. More for the propaganda value than any strategic purpose. He wrote a memoir while he did it, dispatching chapters back to Rome where they were read aloud in the Forum. Simple, in elegant prose that made his victories seem inevitable and his mercy toward defeated enemies seem magnanimous. It was a sustained 8-year political campaign disguised as a war diary. Meanwhile, Crassus got himself killed. The richest man in Rome wanted what his money couldn't buy, military glory to match Pompey and Caesar. In 53 BC, he invaded Parthia, the empire that ruled Persia and Mesopotamia. At Carrhae, Parthian horse archers surrounded his legions, rode circles around them, and shot them to pieces over 2 days of horror. Crassus was captured, killed, and, according to legend, had molten gold poured down his throat as a comment on Roman greed. The story may be invented, but Romans repeated it because it felt true. The 3-way balance collapsed into 2. Caesar in Gaul with his army, Pompey in Rome with the Senate. Neither trusted the other. Neither could back down. In January 49 BC, the Senate demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, where his enemies could prosecute him for his allegedly illegal acts as consul a decade before. Caesar knew what happened to men who surrendered power to their enemies. The Gracchi knew. Sulla's opponents knew. On January 10, 49 BC, Caesar stood on the northern bank of a small river called the Rubicon. It was the boundary between his province and Italy proper. Roman law forbade any general from crossing it with troops. To cross was treason, civil war, a point of no return. The river was narrow, the water cold. His officers waited. "The die is cast," Caesar said, or supposedly said, since he may have been quoting a Greek playwright. He crossed. And the civil war lasted 4 years and spanned the Mediterranean. Pompey abandoned Rome without a fight. He didn't have enough troops in Italy to resist, and he expected to crush Caesar with the legions he could raise in the east. Caesar followed him to Greece, fought an inconclusive battle at Dyrrhachium, and then destroyed Pompey's army at Pharsalus in August 48 BC. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping the boy King Ptolemy would give him sanctuary. Ptolemy's advisors had other ideas. They thought Caesar would reward them for eliminating his enemy. They met Pompey's boat at the dock, and a Roman officer in Egyptian service stabbed him to death before he could reach shore. They cut off his head and brought it to Caesar as a gift. Caesar reportedly wept when he saw it. The weeping might even have been real. Pompey had been his son-in-law once, or his ally, his rival, but never quite his enemy. Or maybe he wept because he'd wanted to grant a pardon, to display the mercy that was becoming his political brand. The Egyptians had stolen his propaganda moment. He stayed in Egypt for months, got involved with Cleopatra, made her pharaoh, fathered a child with her. Then he moved on, to Asia Minor, where he defeated Pompey's allies so quickly he summarized it in 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. To Africa, where the last Pompeian resistance was crushed at Thapsus. To Spain, where Pompey's sons had raised one final army. At Munda in March 45 BC, Caesar nearly lost. The battle was desperate, close quarters, the legions grinding against each other for hours. Caesar himself grabbed a shield and fought in the front ranks to stop a rout. When it was over, 30,000 Pompeians lay dead. Caesar had won everything. He returned to Rome as dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, not a temporary emergency office anymore. Permanent supreme power with no pretense otherwise. The Senate gave him everything: a golden chair, the right to wear purple, a temple with priests, a month named after him. They fell over themselves to grant him honors because the alternative was death. Caesar was merciful to surrendered enemies. That was his brand. But everyone understood that mercy was a gift the powerful gave to the weak. It could be withdrawn. He planned reforms, a new calendar, replacing the chaotic system that required constant adjustment with the solar calendar we still use. Colonies for veterans, massive construction projects to employ the urban poor, extension of citizenship to Gauls and Spaniards. He planned to leave Rome again, to invade Parthia and avenge Crassus. He would not get the chance. 60 senators had been meeting in secret. Some were former Pompeians he had pardoned. Some were old Republicans who genuinely believed they were saving the Republic. Some just wanted power for themselves. They called themselves liberators. They planned to kill him at a Senate meeting on March 15th, 44 BC. Caesar knew about the conspiracy. Multiple people warned him. His wife Calpurnia had nightmares the night before and begged him to stay home. A Greek soothsayer had told him to beware the Ides of March. Caesar dismissed it all. He had disbanded his Spanish bodyguard, a gesture of trust in the Republic's institutions. He had made himself dictator for life by demonstrating that he didn't need guards. He walked into the Senate chamber on the morning of March 15th. The conspirators gathered around him, pretending to present a petition. Someone grabbed his toga from behind. Someone else struck the first blow. They stabbed him 23 times. The daggers got in each other's way. They wounded each other in the frenzy. Brutus, reportedly his illegitimate son, hesitated and was wounded by another conspirator's blade. The most coordinated military machine in history couldn't manage an efficient assassination. Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey. His blood pooled on the marble. The conspirators stood over him, their hands red, their daggers dripping, and waited for the cheers. The cheers didn't come. The senators who hadn't been part of the conspiracy fled. The city fell into terrified silence. The conspirators retreated to the capital and waited for a public reaction that never materialized. The people of Rome, the people whose republic had supposedly been saved, stayed home, locked their doors, and waited to see who would kill whom next. Here was the verdict on the Roman Republic, delivered in blood on marble. They killed Caesar to save a system that had been dead for decades. The Republic of Cincinnatus, of citizen farmers and shared power in annual terms. That republic had died when the Gracchi died, when Sulla marched, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. What remained was a carcass that powerful men fought over. The conspirators murdered a dictator and discovered they had no idea what to do next. 14 years of civil war followed. Caesar's heir, an 18-year-old named Octavian, allied with Mark Antony to hunt down the assassins, then turned on Antony, then defeated him and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC. When it was over, Octavian was the last man standing. He controlled every legion in the Roman world He was richer than the treasury. He was 23 years old. He had a choice to make. The boy who would become Augustus understood something that Caesar had not. Romans needed the fiction. They needed to believe they still lived in a republic, still had elections that mattered, still had a Senate that debated, still had laws that constrained power. The reality didn't matter. The performance did. In 27 BC, Octavian went before the Senate and performed the greatest act of political theater in history when he announced that he was giving up his extraordinary powers. The civil wars were over, the emergency had passed, and he was returning control of the state to the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate begged him not to. This was choreographed. Everyone knew it was choreographed, but the choreography mattered. The Senate insisted that Octavian keep certain provinces, the ones with all the legions, conveniently. They insisted he keep certain powers, the right to propose legislation, immunity from legal prosecution, authority over foreign policy. They gave him a new name, Augustus, the revered one. He called himself Princeps, first citizen, not king, not dictator. He wore simple togas, walked through the city without guards, listened politely to senators he could have executed with a word. He maintained every form of the republic while controlling every lever of power. It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie, but it was a useful lie, and Romans were tired of the truth. Augustus ruled for 45 years. He found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Literally true. He commissioned temples and theaters and forums that transformed the urban landscape. He established a professional civil service, fixed the grain supply, rebuilt the roads and aqueducts and sewers. He created the Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor, stationed legions on the frontiers instead of in Italy, and built a system that would last for centuries. He also solved nothing. The fundamental problem, how do you transfer absolute power when you're pretending you don't have it, remained. Augustus had no surviving sons. His heirs kept dying, one after another, his nephew Marcellus, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius. In desperation, he adopted his stepson Tiberius, a capable general he personally disliked, and made him heir. When Augustus died in 14 AD, his last words were reportedly, "Have I played my part well?" Then applause as the actor exits. The performance would continue for 5 centuries in the West, 15 in the East. The Republic was dead. The Empire had begun, and the engine that had built Roman power, expansion, conquest, new land for veterans, new peoples to absorb, was about to run out of road. Because there were only so many places left to conquer, and when the legions stopped expanding the frontiers, they would turn on each other again, and again, and again. The system Augustus built was a masterpiece of political engineering. It was also a time bomb. He had papered over the contradictions, not resolved them. The army was still loyal to commanders, not institutions. The succession was still a gamble. The frontiers were still a membrane, absorbing peoples Rome called barbarians, but who were often more organized than Rome admitted. For 200 years, the paper held. Then it didn't. The paper held because Rome got lucky. For 80 years after Augustus, the empire stumbled through a succession of emperors who ranged from competent to catastrophic. Tiberius was capable but paranoid, retreating to Capri and ruling through terror from a distance. Caligula was probably insane, certainly murderous, assassinated by his own guards after 4 years. Claudius was underestimated, conquered Britain, and was poisoned by his wife. Nero fancied himself an artist, murdered his mother, and fiddled, or more accurately, sang, while Rome burned. When he was finally overthrown, 4 emperors claimed power in a single year of civil war, and the legions once again demonstrated that they decided who ruled. The system Augustus built had a fatal flaw. It depended on individual emperors being both competent and legitimate, but provided no reliable mechanism for producing either. You could adopt an heir, but adoption was a gamble. You could let your biological son inherit, but biology is not meritocracy. You could let the legions choose, but the legions had different ideas depending on which frontier they garrisoned. Then, almost by accident, Rome stumbled into a solution that worked. 5 consecutive emperors who adopted their successors based on ability, not blood. Nerva chose Trajan. Trajan chose Hadrian. Hadrian chose Antoninus Pius. Antoninus chose Marcus Aurelius. For nearly a century, from 96 to 180 AD, the empire was governed by men selected for their competence, trained for their responsibilities, and constrained by a tradition of adoptive succession that seemed to have solved the succession problem forever. These were the 5 good emperors, and they presided over Rome's peak. Trajan pushed the frontiers to their maximum extent, conquering Dacia for its gold mines, driving into Mesopotamia until Roman soldiers stood on the shores of the Persian Gulf. No Roman army had ever gone so far. At his death in 117 AD, the empire covered 5 million square kilometers. 1 in 4 humans alive lived under Roman rule. Hadrian recognized that Trajan had overreached. He abandoned the Mesopotamian conquests, pulled back to defensible lines, and built the wall across Britain that still bears his name, not because Rome was weak, but because Rome had reached the limits of what could be governed. He traveled the empire obsessively, inspecting every province, reforming every administration, building temples and theaters and aqueducts from Scotland to Egypt. Antoninus Pius ruled for 23 peaceful years, so stable that the ancient sources barely know what to say about him. The empire functioned, the frontiers held, the machinery of government ground on without drama, and Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the closest thing Rome produced to Plato's dream of a philosopher king, spent his reign fighting wars on the Danube frontier, writing stoic meditations in his tent between battles, and trying to hold together an empire that was beginning to crack at the edges. Marcus was the last of the good emperors. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded at the wrong thing. He had a biological son who survived to adulthood, Commodus. For the first time in nearly a century, an emperor had an heir of his own blood. For the first time in nearly a century, the question of succession seemed settled. Marcus loved his son. He trained him, promoted him, made him co-emperor. When Marcus died in 180 AD, worn out from years of frontier warfare and plague, Commodus inherited an empire that was still the most powerful state on earth. Commodus was a disaster. He abandoned the frontier wars his father had nearly won. He retreated to Rome and devoted himself to gladiatorial combat, appearing in the arena to fight wild animals and carefully handicapped opponents. He renamed the months of the year after himself, and he renamed Rome itself, Colony of Commodus. He executed senators on whims, emptied the treasury on spectacle, and ruled through favorites who plundered what he ignored. On the last night of 192 AD, his inner circle decided he had become too dangerous to tolerate. His wrestling partner strangled him in the bath. The year of 5 emperors followed. Civil war returned, and the fragile system that had produced 80 years of stability revealed itself for what it always was, a gamble on personalities, not a solution to institutions. The succession problem hadn't been solved. It had been postponed, and now it came due. The 3rd century shattered Rome. Between 235 and 284 AD, the empire had 26 emperors. Only one died of natural causes. The average reign was less than 3 years. Emperors were made by legions and murdered by rivals so rapidly that some ruled for only weeks before their heads were mounted on spears. Picture what this meant for a soldier on the Danube frontier in the year 260. His name doesn't survive. Call him Marcus, the most common name in the Roman world. He had served for nearly 20 years, following his father into the legions the way Roman men had done for generations. He remembered when the pay was silver. He remembered when the coins in his purse could actually buy things. Now, the coins were bronze washed with silver that rubbed off on his fingers. The same soldiers who had once demanded their pay in denarii now had to be paid 3 times as much in debased currency that merchants weighed instead of counted, because the official value was a fiction everyone pretended to believe. A Marcus had seen 3 emperors in the last 18 months. The latest one, Gallienus, was off in the east fighting usurpers, while the frontier he was supposed to defend crumbled. There were Goths across the river, not raiding parties anymore, but whole peoples moving, looking for land, looking for safety from whatever was pushing them from behind. Marcus's legion was supposed to stop them. His legion was at half strength, hadn't been paid in months, and was starting to wonder if there was any point defending an empire that couldn't defend them. The general was talking about declaring for a new emperor. Another general in Pannonia had already raised the purple. If Marcus's legion joined him, maybe the new man would actually pay them. Maybe he'd win, and they'd get land and donatives. Maybe he'd lose, and they'd all die. But dying in civil war was starting to seem no different from dying on a frontier no one reinforced. They declared for the usurper on a Tuesday morning. Marcus remembered the exact moment, his centurion gathering them together, the general putting on the purple cloak someone had found or made, the oath sworn to a new emperor whose name Marcus would forget within a year. They marched south to fight Gallienus's loyalists. Behind them, the Gothic tribes they were supposed to contain pushed through the gaps. Marcus heard later that his family's town, 50 miles from the river, had been sacked. He never found out what happened to his wife and children. There were no survivors to tell him, and by the time he could have searched, the Goths had moved on and the town was ashes. This happened 100 times during the crisis, 1,000 times. The armies that were supposed to defend the frontiers spent most of their energy fighting each other. The barbarians didn't break down the door. They walked through holes that Rome tore in itself. The empire fragmented. For 15 years, a separate Gallic empire ruled what is now France, Britain, and Spain, technically in rebellion against the legitimate emperor, practically functioning as its own state because the center couldn't control it. In the east, the city of Palmyra, a caravan hub on the edge of the Syrian desert, built an empire of its own under Queen Zenobia. She conquered Egypt, Asia Minor, and Syria. She minted coins with her face on them. She called herself Empress. Meanwhile, in 260 AD, something happened that still shocks historians who study it. The Emperor Valerian led a campaign against the Sassanid Persians, Rome's great rival in the east. Plague had weakened his army. He requested a parley to negotiate peace terms. The Persian king Shapur took him captive instead. No Roman emperor had ever been captured in battle. Not by Hannibal, not by the Parthians, not in 500 years of warfare against every enemy Rome had ever faced. Valerian spent the rest of his life as a human footstool for the Persian king. When he died, his skin was supposedly stuffed and displayed in a temple as a trophy. The details may be legend, but Romans repeated them because the humiliation felt true. The empire Valerian had ruled was coming apart. Plague had killed perhaps a third of the population. The plague of Cyprian, which raged for nearly 20 years and emptied cities across the Mediterranean. Trade collapsed. The great road system that had connected the empire was becoming dangerous to travel. Cities that hadn't needed walls since the Gallic sack 700 years earlier were frantically building them. The life layer of the empire had inverted. Where Gaius the merchant had walked into a Rome of 1 million people, crowded and chaotic but functioning, his great-great-grandson would have found a city where whole neighborhoods lay empty, where the aqueducts that once supplied water to every district now served only the wealthy hilltops, where the grain ships arrived less often and the prices in the markets, when the markets functioned at all, had multiplied beyond recognition. The silver denarius that had served Rome for 3 centuries was worthless. In 200 AD, it was 90% silver. By 270, it was less than 5%. A bronze coin with a thin wash of silver that fooled no one. The government paid soldiers in increasingly worthless money, then demanded taxes be paid in goods instead of coins, because even the government didn't trust its own currency. This wasn't decline. This was state failure, a Ponzi scheme that had finally run out of new suckers. Then, improbably, the empire reconstituted itself. A series of soldier emperors, hard men from the Balkan provinces, professional soldiers who had clawed their way to the purple through battlefield merit, gradually fought the pieces back together. Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275, reconquered the breakaway Gallic Empire and crushed Zenobia's Palmyrene state. He built the walls around Rome that still stand today. The city hadn't needed walls in 800 years, and now it desperately did. He called himself Restorer of the World. His secretaries murdered him over a clerical error. But the restoration continued. By 284 AD, the empire was reunited under a single ruler. The frontiers had contracted but stabilized. The crisis was over. What emerged was not the same Rome. The man who put the pieces back together was named Diocletian, and he understood that the old system was gone. He had risen from nothing, born to a freedman family in Dalmatia, promoted through the ranks on ability alone, made emperor by his soldiers after winning a civil war. He had seen the chaos up close. He had no illusions about constitutional fictions or Augustan pretense. The empire was too large for one man to govern and one army to defend. Diocletian's solution was radical. Split the job. He created the Tetrarchy, 4 emperors ruling simultaneously, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars. Each ruled a quarter of the empire, with their own court, their own army, their own capital. The 4 would cooperate, coordinate defense, and when an Augustus died or retired, the Caesars would step up and appoint new juniors. It was corporate management applied to imperial government. He quadrupled the bureaucracy. Provinces were split into smaller units, easier to control, harder for ambitious governors to use as power bases. Tax collection was systematized. The army was reorganized, with frontier troops separated from mobile reserves that could be deployed wherever crisis demanded. The machinery of state became larger, more intrusive, and vastly more expensive. The expense was the problem. Diocletian inherited a debased currency and an economy that had lost faith in money. His attempted solution, a price edict fixing maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, with death as the penalty for violation, failed almost immediately. Merchants simply stopped selling. The edict became a dead letter. The economic crisis continued. Diocletian also noticed that Christians were growing inconvenient. The religion had been spreading for 2 centuries, but it had mostly been ignored except during periodic panics. Now its adherents were numerous enough to matter, and they had an uncomfortable habit of refusing to sacrifice to the traditional gods whose protection the empire supposedly enjoyed. In a time of crisis, when divine favor seemed to have abandoned Rome, someone needed to be blamed. And Diocletian's persecution of Christians was the most systematic in Roman history. Churches burned, scriptures were destroyed, clergy were arrested, tortured, killed. Ordinary believers lost property, jobs, liberty, life. The persecution lasted nearly a decade and killed thousands. It also failed. The church survived. In some places, it grew stronger. Martyrdom turned out to be good for recruitment. When Diocletian retired in 305 AD, the first Roman emperor to voluntarily step down since the Republic, his tetrarchy system immediately collapsed into civil war, and one of the contenders discovered that Christianity was more useful as an ally than an enemy. Constantine was the son of one of Diocletian's Caesars, raised in the imperial court, trained in warfare, ambitious enough to seize the purple when his father died. And the civil war that followed Diocletian's retirement lasted nearly 2 decades and narrowed the field to Constantine in the west and Licinius in the east. In 312 AD, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly saw a vision, a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields. They won the battle. Constantine became sole emperor of the West, and Christianity became something it had never been before, imperially favored. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD legalized Christianity throughout the empire. What had been persecuted was now permitted. Within a generation, it was privileged. Constantine funded churches, intervened in theological disputes, and convened the Council of Nicaea to settle questions of doctrine, with the emperor presiding. As if Jesus were a policy matter requiring imperial decision, he also moved the capital. Rome itself had become a backwater, too far from the frontiers that mattered, too full of ancient traditions that no longer served power. Constantine built a new city on the site of the old Greek colony of Byzantium, at the strategic choke point where Europe met Asia and the Black Sea met the Mediterranean. He named it after himself, Constantinople. The city would be the capital of the Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. It would outlast Rome itself by a millennium, and its establishment marked a truth that Romans had spent centuries avoiding. The empire's future was in the east. The tetrarchy had failed. Constantine's sole rule had succeeded, but the underlying problem remained. How do you transfer power in a system designed around one man? Constantine solved it the old way, by having sons and dividing the empire among them. They promptly began murdering each other. The pattern would repeat for a century. Strong emperors briefly unified the state. Weak successions fragmented it. The eastern half, wealthier, more urbanized, better protected by geography, consistently proved more stable. The western half, with its longer frontiers and more exposed provinces, lurched from crisis to crisis. And across those frontiers, peoples were moving. The barbarian invasions were not what you've been told. The popular image is a horde, savage warriors streaming across the Rhine and Danube, overwhelming Roman defenses, burning cities, ending civilization. It makes for good cinema. It's mostly wrong, and the Germanic peoples who crossed into Roman territory in the 4th and 5th centuries were not alien invaders. Many had served as Roman auxiliaries for generations. They wore Roman-style clothing, fought with Roman-style weapons, often worshipped the Christian God in the Aryan form. They wanted to be part of the Roman system, not to destroy it. What pushed them was pressure from behind. The Huns, nomadic warriors from the Asian steppes, whose origins are still debated, swept westward in the late 4th century, displacing the Gothic tribes who had lived north of the Danube. The Goths petitioned the Roman emperor for permission to cross the river, to settle on Roman land as allies and subjects. The emperor Valens agreed. In 376 AD, perhaps 200,000 Goths crossed the Danube under Roman supervision. It was supposed to be an orderly resettlement. It was a disaster. Roman officials exploited the refugees, charging them extortionate prices for food, taking their children as slaves, providing nothing of what had been promised. The Goths, starving and betrayed, revolted. Valens led an army to crush them. At Adrianople, in 378 AD, the Gothic cavalry destroyed the Roman legions and killed the emperor on the battlefield. It was Rome's worst military defeat since Cannae, 6 centuries earlier. The empire had survived Hannibal. The question was whether it could survive Adrianople. Theodosius I managed to stabilize the situation, settling the Goths in the Balkans as federates, officially Roman allies, practically an armed nation living inside Roman borders under their own leaders. It was a compromise born of desperation. It also became the template for the next century. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Burgundians. Tribe after tribe crossed the frontiers, sometimes invited as allies, sometimes forcing their way, always changing what Roman meant. They wanted land, title, recognition. They wanted to be Roman. The empire kept absorbing them, using them as soldiers and settlers, hoping to domesticate what it couldn't defeat. In 410 AD, it failed. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, had spent years negotiating with various Roman emperors, demanding land and titles, sometimes fighting, sometimes serving. When the Western emperor refused his latest demands, Alaric marched on Rome itself. The city that had not been taken by a foreign enemy in 800 years, not by Hannibal, not by the Gauls after the sack was avenged, and not by anyone, fell in August 410. Alaric's Visigoths spent 3 days in the city, taking what they could carry, respecting churches because they were Christian, and then moving on to find land in Gaul. The sack was relatively gentle as sacks go. No mass slaughter, no burning of the city, no permanent occupation. Within a week, Alaric was gone, and Romans were drifting back to their homes. The psychological damage was immeasurable. Across the Mediterranean, in Hippo Regius in North Africa, a bishop named Augustine was writing a massive book trying to explain how the Christian God could have allowed the eternal city to fall. The book was called The City of God, and it argued that the earthly city, Rome, was always destined to pass, because only the heavenly city was eternal. It was the theology of decline, the end of confidence. And the Western Empire lasted another 66 years, but the question was no longer whether it would survive. The question was who would inherit the corpse. Vandals crossed from Spain to North Africa, seizing the grain provinces that fed Rome. Without Egyptian grain, which the Eastern Empire kept for itself, and without African grain, which the Vandals now controlled, Rome's population collapsed. A city of 1 million shrank to tens of thousands. The great apartment blocks stood empty. The aqueducts that had served a metropolis now fed a ghost town. Attila's Huns swept through Gaul in 451, defeated at the Catalonian plains by a coalition of Romans and Visigoths. It was Rome's last great military victory, and Rome barely participated. The empire was now defended by the very barbarians who were supposed to be the enemy. By 476 AD, and the end was almost anticlimactic. The last Western emperor was a boy named Romulus Augustus, the name a cruel joke, combining Rome's founder with its first emperor in diminutive form. He was a puppet, placed on the throne by his father, a general named Orestes. The actual power lay with barbarian warlords who had become kingmakers. One of them, a Germanic general named Odoacer, decided the pretense was no longer useful. He deposed Romulus, sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, and informed the Eastern Emperor that the West no longer needed a separate ruler. Odoacer would govern Italy himself, nominally as a representative of the Eastern court. There was no battle, no siege, no dramatic last stand. A teenager was told to go home, given a pension in a villa in Campania, and history's greatest empire ended with a severance package. The fall of Rome was not a fall. It was a gradual purchase, piece by piece, by people who wanted to be Roman more than the actual Romans did. Germanic kings ruled with Roman laws, collected Roman taxes, employed Roman administrators, wore Roman clothing. The Senate still met. The aqueducts still ran. Those that hadn't been cut. Latin was still spoken, still written, still the language of law and learning. What ended was not Roman civilization. What ended was the political fiction that one government controlled the Western Mediterranean. The reality had been fragmenting for a century. The fiction finally caught up, and in the East, a city called Constantinople carried on. Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, administratively Roman, and it would call itself the Roman Empire for another 1,000 years. The emperors in Constantinople never accepted that the Western Empire had fallen. To them, the West had simply been temporarily lost, occupied by barbarians who might someday be reconquered. The civilization that had built roads from Scotland to Syria, that had unified the Mediterranean for half a millennium, that had created a legal system and a calendar and an alphabet that the entire Western world would inherit. That civilization was not dead. It had just stopped calling itself Rome. In 480 AD, 4 years after Romulus Augustulus received his pension and retired to obscurity, a Roman aristocrat named Julius Nepos was murdered in his villa in Dalmatia. Technically, Nepos had been the legitimate Western emperor. He'd been deposed by Orestes before Odoacer deposed Orestes. Technically, his death, not the deposition of a teenage puppet, marked the end of the Western imperial line. No one noticed. No one cared. The bureaucrats in Constantinople filed it away. The barbarian kings in Gaul and Spain and Italy continued doing what they'd been doing, running their kingdoms with Roman laws, Roman administrators, Roman tax collectors. The great transformation had already happened. The paperwork was catching up. What did the world look like in the decades after 476? Less different than you'd expect. In Italy, Odoacer ruled for 17 years before being conquered and murdered by Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths. Theodoric was an interesting man. Raised as a hostage in Constantinople, educated in Greek, an admirer of Roman civilization. He governed Italy for 33 years, and his reign looked remarkably like a late Roman administration. The Senate still met. The aqueducts were maintained. The circus games continued. Latin remained the language of law and government. Theodoric couldn't read, but he employed Roman scholars to run his administration and write his letters. He also maintained the legal separation between Goths and Romans. Goths were warriors. Romans were civilians. Goths followed their own law. Romans followed Roman law. It was apartheid as administrative policy, but it preserved Roman institutions precisely by not forcing them to absorb the conquerors. In Gaul, the Franks were building something similar. Clovis, their first great king, are converted to Catholic Christianity around 496. Not to the Arian Christianity most Germanic tribes practiced, but to the same faith as the Roman population he ruled. The bishops loved him. The Roman aristocracy could work with him. Within a generation, the distinction between Frank and Gallo-Roman was already blurring. The roads still ran. More dangerous now, bandits, tolls, fewer patrols, but they still ran. A traveler in 520 AD could still walk from Ravenna to Arles on paved Roman roads, still find inns and hostels along the way, still pay in coins that bore Roman emperors' faces, even if those emperors had been dead for a century. But the cities were emptying. Rome itself, which had held 1 million people at its peak, shrank to perhaps 50,000 by 550 AD. The great apartment blocks stood empty, their upper floors collapsing, their ground floors converted to livestock pens. The aqueducts that had brought fresh water to every district were cut during Gothic sieges. Those that survived served a population a fraction of what they'd been built for. The forums that had thundered with commerce and politics became grazing land. Cattle wandered where senators had debated. This was not apocalypse. This was adjustment. The infrastructure built for 1 million people was being repurposed for a town. The roads built for legions were being walked by merchants and pilgrims. The laws written for an empire were being applied in kingdoms. Rome was dying, and Rome was everywhere. In the East, something stranger was happening. Rome was continuing. A Constantinople in 500 AD was the largest city in the Christian world, 500,000 people behind walls so massive they would not be breached for another 1,000 years. Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, administratively Roman, it called itself the Roman Empire, because that's what it was. The emperors in Constantinople traced their authority directly back to Augustus. They used the same titles, the same ceremonies, the same legal codes. When the Western Empire fragmented, they considered it a temporary setback, a territory to be reconquered when opportunity allowed. In 533 AD, opportunity arrived. The Emperor Justinian, the last emperor to speak Latin as a first language, the last to dream of reuniting the Mediterranean, sent his general Belisarius to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals. It took 18 months. Belisarius entered Carthage in triumph, ending a century of Vandal rule, restoring Roman authority to the province that had once fed Rome. Then Italy. The Gothic kingdom was collapsing into civil war, and Justinian saw his chance. Belisarius conquered Sicily in 535, marched up the peninsula, and took Rome itself in December 536. For a moment, it seemed like the old empire might be reborn. The wars that followed devastated Italy more than the original barbarian settlements ever had. Gothic resistance was fierce. Belisarius was recalled, replaced, sent back, recalled again. Rome changed hands 5 times. The aqueducts were cut for good. The population collapsed further. By the time the fighting ended in 554, Italy was a wasteland, Roman again in name, ruined in reality. Justinian's reconquest was a corpse painted to look healthy. Within a generation, the Lombards invaded Italy, and most of the peninsula was lost again. North Africa would fall to the Arabs in the 7th century. The dream of Mediterranean unity died in the sands. But Justinian left something that outlasted his conquests: the Corpus Juris Civilis, the codification of Roman law completed in 534 AD. His scholars gathered centuries of imperial edicts, legal commentaries, and jurisprudential writings into a systematic code. 1,600 years later, It remains the foundation of civil law in most of Europe. Every contract you sign, every property you own, every court that hears your case operates on principles Roman jurists defined while the empire was collapsing around them. The law outlived the state, and so did the church. When the Western Empire fragmented, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, found himself the last functioning institution in Italy. The Senate faded, the emperors vanished, the bishops remained with their congregations, their properties, their records, their claim to spiritual authority that transcended political boundaries. The Pope inherited Rome's position without inheriting its legions. He became the arbiter of disputes between barbarian kings, the legitimizer of dynasties, the keeper of a tradition that connected the German warriors who ruled Europe to the civilization they had replaced. He corresponded in Latin with officials who had once reported to emperors. He maintained a bureaucracy modeled on imperial administration. He claimed universal jurisdiction, just as the emperors had. In 800 AD, on Christmas Day in Rome, Pope Leo III crowned a Frankish king named Charlemagne as Roman emperor. It was a deliberate echo, a claim of continuity. Charlemagne couldn't read Latin. His capital was in Aachen, far from Rome. His empire had nothing to do with the Roman state, but he wanted the title, and the Pope wanted a protector, and so they pretended. And the pretense shaped European politics for 1,000 years. The Holy Roman Empire that descended from Charlemagne's coronation lasted until 1806. Voltaire was right that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But the name mattered. The ghost mattered. Every ambitious European ruler for a millennium measured himself against an empire that had fallen before his ancestors learned to write. The czars of Russia called themselves Caesar. The Kaisers of Germany called themselves Caesar. The Ottoman sultans, who conquered Constantinople in 1453, styled themselves Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. The city that Greek emperors had ruled became the capital of a Muslim empire, and its new rulers still felt the need to claim Rome's inheritance. Everyone wanted to be Rome. No one could rebuild it. Walk into a courthouse anywhere in the Western world, and you walk into Rome's ghost. The distinction between criminal law and civil law, Roman. The concept of legal precedent, Roman. The idea that contracts are binding, that property can be owned and transferred, that citizenship confers rights, Roman. The legal vocabulary itself, jurisdiction, testimony, verdict, advocate, evidence, appeal, Latin words, anglicized or translated, still doing the work they were invented for. Open a calendar. The months are Roman. January for Janus, god of beginnings, to March for Mars, July for Julius Caesar, who fixed the chaotic republican calendar into something that tracked the actual solar year. August for Augustus, who demanded a month of his own. The leap year that corrects the calendar's drift from the sun. That's Caesar's solution too, calculated by Alexandrian astronomers in 46 BC. Look at any map of Western Europe. The borders between nations track, more often than not, the boundaries of Roman provinces. France is roughly Gaul. Spain and Portugal split the Iberian Peninsula, where Roman administration once divided it. The Rhine frontier, where legions watched Germanic forests, still separates Romance languages from Germanic ones. Drive from Strasbourg to Stuttgart, 40 miles, and you cross the linguistic line the legions drew. Every alphabet you read in the Western world is Roman. The letters on this screen, the signs on your streets, the words in your books, these are the Latin alphabet, developed from Greek, spread by conquest, adapted for languages Romans never heard. English is a Germanic language, but it spells itself in Rome's letters. So does Swahili. So does Vietnamese. And every Western church, from the cathedral to the storefront, carries Rome's organizational DNA. The dioceses that bishops oversee are Roman provincial boundaries. The hierarchy of priest, bishop, archbishop, patriarch mirrors Roman administrative ranks. The Latin Mass, used until the 1960s, preserved a dead language for 15 centuries after the empire that spoke it vanished. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, he speaks from a chair, a throne. And the word throne comes from the Latin cathedra, which came from the Greek cathedra, which meant the same thing 2,000 years ago. The empire built a frame. Everyone who came after hung their pictures on it. The paradox from the beginning: Rome didn't fall, it transformed. But why? What was the engine that ran for 1,000 years? And what was the poison built into the fuel? You know the answer now. You've watched it play out across 3 continents in a millennium. Expansion. Expansion was Rome's engine. Conquer territory, absorb peoples, turn enemies into allies, into citizens, into soldiers who conquer more territory. The loop that built Rome was the same loop that threatened to break it, because expansion requires constant momentum, constant new frontiers, constant new peoples to integrate. Stop expanding, and the army has no loot to distribute. Stop expanding, and the frontiers become walls instead of membranes. Stop expanding, and the system that was designed for growth must learn to maintain instead. And Rome never figured out how to do that gracefully. The Republic broke because it conquered too much too fast, and the generals who won those conquests became more powerful than the state they served. The empire worked for 2 centuries because expansion slowed, stabilized, became something more like maintenance, and because lucky runs of competent emperors papered over the structural problems. Then expansion stopped, the cracks reopened, and 3 centuries of fragmentation followed. Rome didn't die of decadence or Christianity or lead poisoning or barbarian invasion. Rome died of success, the very thing that made it great: the ability to grow, to absorb, and to transform enemies into Romans also made it impossible to sustain once the growth stopped. Empires built for expansion cannot easily become states built for stability. Rome tried. Rome failed. And then Rome became a ghost, a model, an inheritance, a standard against which every successor would measure themselves and fall short. There is a road in southern France that the locals call the Via Domitia. It was built in 118 BC to connect Italy to Spain, and it was the first Roman road outside of Italy itself. The stones have been repaired, replaced, covered over, exposed again across 2,000 years. In some places, you can see the original Roman paving. In others, asphalt covers what lies beneath. Cars drive over it. Trucks carrying goods from Lyon to Barcelona follow a route that Roman legions marched. The road has been widened, rerouted, bypassed by motorways. But the basic path, the route through the mountains that some Roman surveyor laid out when the Republic was still fighting over the Gracchi's land reforms, that route endures. When the asphalt cracks, and it will, the Roman stones will still be there. That's the ghost. That's what survives. Not the legions or the emperors or the triumphs or the games. Not the marble forums, most of which were stripped for building materials by people who needed the stone more than they needed the memories. What survives is the frame. The roads, the laws, the letters, the calendar, the borders, the institutional shapes that Rome created, and its successors found too useful to abandon. 1,000 years of empire, 500 years of republic before that, and then 1,500 years of everyone who came after, in still building on the foundations, still arguing about the inheritance, still calling themselves Roman when it suited them. The empire that built this road lasted 1,000 years. The stones will last longer. If this journey through 1,000 years of Roman history changed how you see the ancient world, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We're building something here. Deep documentaries that treat history not as a timeline to memorize, but as a story to understand. Next time, the empire that inherited Rome's dream and lasted even longer, the Byzantine Empire, 1,000 years in the shadow of a ghost. Until then, remember, the roads beneath your feet were laid by people who believed their world would last forever. They were wrong about that. They were right about the roads.